The arrival. Professor Zalax watched through all four of his eyes as the human transport ship descended through Centaur Prime's lavender atmosphere. His bioluminescent spots flickered with barely contained anxiety, a tell that would have embarrassed him if he weren't so preoccupied with the impending disaster about to unfold at his beloved Galactic Defense Academy. Director, his assistant Vex, for 27 chirped, mechanical appendages clicking nervously. The human delegates are requesting permission to begin decontamination procedures. Zalax's facial membranes rippled in what his species considered a sigh. Granted, he said, but triple the standard protocols. The last thing we need is some earthborne pathogen disrupting the semester. As he stood in the welcome chamber, surrounded by the Academy's most distinguished faculty, 42 species represented in all their varied glory, Zalax couldn't help but remember the day the Galactic Council had made their outrageous demand. Integration, they'd said, as if admitting Death Worlders into the galaxy's most prestigious military institution was as simple as adding new equations to the quantum physics curriculum. The decontamination process took precisely 47 minutes. Zalax knew because he'd counted every excruciating second, his auxiliary brain already calculating the probability of survival for these human cadets. The results weren't encouraging. When the airlock finally cycled open, the assembled faculty collectively held their breath, or equivalent respiratory functions. 3 figures stepped through the threshold, and Zalax's worst fears were immediately confirmed. They looked absurdly fragile. Mason Drake led the group, his red hair catching the light of Centaur's binary suns like burning copper. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed to deny the planet's 2.3 standard gravity, his Earth military posture almost comically rigid. Behind him, Nova Chen's dark eyes scanned the chamber with an intensity that made even the telepathic professors uncomfortable. And then there was Rex Thompson, bringing up the rear with what humans called a grin plastered across his face, as if the whole thing was some elaborate entertainment program. Welcome, Zalax managed, his translator working overtime to produce the proper vocal frequencies, to the Galactic Defense Academy. Thank you, Professor Zalax, Mason Drake replied, executing a perfect bow that incorporated elements of 17 different species' traditional greetings. Zalax's spots flickered in surprise. They'd done their homework. We are honored, Nova Chen added, her voice carrying the precise harmonic undertones that made the crystalline faculty members vibrate pleasantly. Rex Thompson just widened his grin. Nice setup you've got here. The gravity's a bit heavy, though. Mind if we crank it up a notch for morning workouts? The faculty's unified gasp of shock was interrupted by a deep, resonating laugh. All eyes turned to Commander Bright Spire, the luminary who held the record for fastest program completion. I like this one, he announced, his crystalline form shimmering with amusement. They don't know enough to be properly terrified. Zalax's primary heart sank. This was exactly what he'd feared, not that the humans would fail, but that they would fail spectacularly enough to damage the Academy's reputation. The curriculum had been carefully designed over centuries, each element precisely calibrated to push students to their absolute limits while remaining theoretically possible to complete. The quantum physics courses alone required simultaneous comprehension of 15 dimensions. The xenobiology segments contained information that had driven several species to temporary madness. The combat training took place in gravity fields that could literally crush most life forms. And the psychic resistance courses, well, they'd lost 3 students last year just during the preliminary screening. Perhaps, Zalax said carefully, we should begin with a tour of the theoretical physics department. The basic orientation usually takes 2 years, but we can cover the fundamental concepts in a few dash. Actually, Nova Chen interrupted, pulling out what appeared to be a primitive datapad, we've already completed the preliminary readings. All 15 dimensions, right? Plus the quantum uncertainty principles in nonlinear time streams. We have some questions about the practical applications in combat scenarios. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient hum of the Academy's gravity generators seemed to pause in shock. Rex Thompson raised his hand, still wearing that insufferable grin. Quick question about the combat training. These gravity fields you mentioned, they go up to what, 12 standard units? Shouldn't we start higher if we want to simulate real combat conditions? Commander Bright Spire's crystalline form actually cracked slightly in surprise, a sound like tinkling bells filling the chamber. Mason Drake, apparently oblivious to the chaos he and his companions were causing, pulled out his own datapad. And regarding the psychic resistance training, we've developed some interesting techniques combining Earth meditation practices with quantum field theory. We'd love to get your input on the calculations. Zalax's spots weren't just flickering now, they were strobing in patterns that would have been considered profanity in polite company. These humans hadn't just studied the preliminary materials, they'd apparently decided to rewrite them. Perhaps, he managed, his translator struggling to maintain a neutral tone, we should discuss this in my office. As he led the three humans away from the still-stunned faculty, Zalax couldn't shake the feeling that something unprecedented was about to unfold. His species had evolved from creatures that could predict planetary weather patterns with perfect accuracy, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that a storm was coming. He just couldn't decide if it would destroy his beloved academy, or transform it into something entirely new. Commander Bright Spire watched them go, his crystalline form resonating with frequencies that hadn't been heard in the academy for centuries. Well, he chimed to no one in particular, this should be interesting. In his office, Zalax settled behind his desk, its smart surface automatically adjusting to accommodate his species' unique physiological needs. The three humans sat across from him, seemingly comfortable despite the chairs being designed for entirely different anatomical configurations. Let me be clear, he began, his spots now under rigid control, the Academy's curriculum is not a suggestion. It is not a starting point for negotiation. It is the culmination of 10,000 years of galactic educational evolution. Exactly. Rex Thompson exclaimed, leaning forward with enthusiasm. That's why we're so excited to help it evolve further. Zalax's secondary nervous system actually shut down for a moment in shock. When it rebooted, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 centuries of teaching, he laughed. The sound, somewhere between crystalline wind chimes and quantum particle decay, filled the office. The humans exchanged glances but didn't seem particularly perturbed. Help it evolve, Zalax repeated, his translator struggling with the concept. You three want to help evolve a curriculum that has produced the finest military minds in known space. Nova Chen nodded seriously. Everything evolves, Professor. Even evolution itself. Isn't that what your own species proved in the great theory of adaptive recursion? Zalax's spots went completely dark. They'd studied his personal research papers too. Look, Mason Drake said, his voice carrying that peculiar human quality that somehow commanded attention, we understand the concern. We're from a death world, barely space-capable by galactic standards, and we probably seem hopelessly primitive to you. But, Nova continued, that's exactly why we might see things differently. Sometimes the best innovations come from outside perspectives. And let's be honest, Rex added, your combat scenarios could use some spicing up. I mean, only 12 standard gravity units. That's barely a workout. Zalax found himself wondering if his translator was malfunctioning. A workout, he repeated flatly. Cadet Thompson, 12 standard gravity units can turn most species into quantum paste. Exactly. Rex's grin somehow widened further. That's why you have to learn to work around it. Physics is physics, but there's always a loophole if you're creative enough. We've actually been experimenting with some ideas, Nova said, pulling up complex equations on her datapad. If you combine traditional inertial dampeners with localized quantum field manipulation. As the humans launched into an increasingly elaborate technical discussion, Zalax felt his worldview beginning to shift. These weren't the primitive Death Worlders he'd expected. They were something else entirely, something that perhaps the galaxy hadn't seen before. They were impossible, and they didn't seem to know it. Or worse, they knew it and didn't care. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of increasingly improbable conversations. The humans had questions about everything, but not the usual basic inquiries Zalax had come to expect from new students. Instead, they posed complex theoretical scenarios that even the senior faculty found challenging. As the binary sun set, casting Centaur Prime's signature purple twilight across the Academy's quantum glass spires, Zalax found himself back in his office, recording his daily log. Senior Director's log, Day 1 of the Human Integration Initiative, he spoke to the recorder. I find myself in the unprecedented position of having to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about educational theory, species development, and the nature of possibility itself. He paused, his spots flickering in patterns that would take other species years to decode. The humans aren't just adapting to our curriculum. They're adapting it to themselves. And perhaps that's exactly what we've been missing all these years. The recorder hummed softly, waiting for more. Computer, personal note, I have either just witnessed the beginning of the Academy's greatest triumph, or its most spectacular disaster. The remarkable thing is, I'm no longer sure which outcome I'm hoping for. As if to punctuate his uncertainty, a distant explosion rocked the building, followed by the distinct sound of human laughter and what appeared to be, was that Earth music. Zalax's spots flickered in resignation. Computer, add secondary note, requisition additional insurance coverage for the practical physics laboratory. Something tells me we're going to need it. The next few days would prove him right in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Breaking the impossible. 2 weeks into the human integration experiment, Professor Zalax stood in the Academy's primary observation chamber, all 4 eyes fixed on the quantum combat simulation below. His spots were pulsing with such intense anxiety that several empathic faculty members had to leave the room. They can't possibly survive this, Professor NX Clax chittered, her insectoid mandibles clicking rapidly. The Kraken scenario has a 99.98% failure rate even among graduate students. Commander Bright Spire's crystalline form hummed thoughtfully. And yet they specifically requested it. Not just requested, they insisted on running it at maximum difficulty. Below, in the sprawling holographic arena, Mason Drake, Nova Chen, and Rex Thompson stood back to back, surrounded by the shimmering tentacles of a quantum-enhanced space kraken. The creature existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, its attacks coming from directions that shouldn't technically exist. The simulation had been designed as a graduate-level theoretical exercise. No one had ever actually attempted to fight the creature. It was meant to teach students about the limitations of 3-dimensional combat thinking. Rex Thompson's voice crackled over the observation room speakers. Hey, Nova, remember that party trick you used to do with the chopsticks? Seriously? Nova's laugh echoed through the chamber. That's your solution. Think about it, Mason cut in, ducking under a tentacle that curved through 4-dimensional space. If you combine it with that quantum field manipulation theory we were discussing. Zalax's spots flickered in confusion. What could an Earth-eating utensil possibly have to do with multidimensional combat? Nova Chen's face lit up with understanding. Mason, remember those calculations we were working on last night? About localizing quantum uncertainty? The probability bubble theory? Mason grinned. Rex, you're a genius. I know, Rex replied, that insufferable grin still plastered across his face even as a tentacle passed through where his head had been a microsecond before. Now, shall we show this overgrown calamari why you don't mess with Earth seafood lovers? What happened next would later require 17 different physics departments to explain, and even then, 3 of the explanations violated known laws of reality. Nova Chen began moving her hands in what appeared to be a simple game humans played with eating utensils, but each movement left trails of quantum probability in its wake. Mason Drake started reciting what seemed to be Earth poetry, something about ravens and writing desks, that somehow created patterns in the probability field. And Rex Thompson started dancing. Are they Are they playing with quantum uncertainty fields? Professor NX Clax's mandibles nearly locked up in shock. Impossible, Zalax muttered, but even as he said it, he could see what was happening. The humans weren't trying to fight the Kraken in normal space. They were using Nova's movements to create a lattice of quantum probabilities, Mason's rhythmic words to stabilize the pattern, and Rex's seemingly random dance moves to weave through the gaps. The Kraken, programmed to attack in 7 dimensions, couldn't adapt to targets that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. Its tentacles passed through probability clouds where the humans should have been, while the actual cadets slipped through dimensional gaps that shouldn't have existed. "This is unprecedented," Commander Bright Spire chimed, his crystalline form resonating with excitement. "They're not just thinking outside conventional dimensions, they're creating their own rules of engagement." In the arena below, Nova's quantum lattice had grown to encompass the entire space. Mason's words had taken on a strange harmony that seemed to bend reality itself, and Rex's dance had evolved into something that hurt to look at directly. The Kraken, faced with targets it couldn't properly perceive, began to dissolve into its component quantum particles. "Simulation complete," the computer announced. "Scenario successfully resolved. New record established, 3 minutes, 17 seconds. The previous record had been impossible." The observation chamber erupted into chaos. Professor NX Clax was trying to explain what she'd seen to a group of theoretical physics students, her mandibles moving so fast they created their own probability distortions. Commander Bright Spire had started resonating at frequencies that made several pieces of equipment malfunction. Zalax just stood there, his spots cycling through colors that hadn't been seen since the Great Quantum Wars. Down in the arena, the 3 humans were celebrating in their typically incomprehensible way, performing what they called high fives and making jokes about calamari. "Professor Zalax." His assistant's mechanical voice snapped him back to reality. "The Galactic Council is requesting an immediate update on the Human Integration Project. Tell them." Zalax paused, his translator struggling to find the right words. "Tell them that we may need to rewrite several laws of physics." The next morning, Zalax found the 3 humans in the Academy's quantum physics lab, surrounded by holograms covered in calculations that made his auxiliary brain hurt. "Ah, Professor." Rex called out cheerfully. "We've been meaning to ask, have you ever considered applying Earth music theory to quantum field manipulation? We've got some ideas about using harmony to stabilize multidimensional probability matrices." Zalax's spots went completely dark. "You want to sing to quantum fields?" "Not exactly," Nova explained, pulling up a complex series of equations. "It's more about using harmonic resonance patterns as a framework for organizing quantum probability states. See, Earth music already deals with multiple dimensions, time, frequency, amplitude, texture. And if you combine that with traditional Earth dance movements," Mason added, "you can create physical patterns that mirror quantum-level interactions. That's what Rex was doing yesterday with the Kraken." "I call it the quantum cha-cha," Rex said proudly. "Though we might need to work on the name." Zalax found himself doing something he'd been doing more and more lately, laughing. "You 3 do realize you're completely destroying 10,000 years of established theoretical frameworks, don't you?" "With all due respect, Professor," Nova said, her eyes twinkling, "sometimes frameworks need to be destroyed before they can evolve." "Besides," Rex added, "who says physics has to be boring? Back on Earth, we have this saying, if you're not having fun, you're not doing it right." "That's not a real Earth saying," Mason pointed out. "It is now," Rex grinned. "I just said it, didn't I?" Before Zalax could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the Academy. Red warning lights pulsed in patterns that indicated a Class 1 emergency, the highest possible threat level. "Security breach in the Dimensional Research Lab," the computer announced. "Warning, reality fracture detected. Containment protocols failing." Zalax's spots went pale. The Dimensional Research Lab contains some of the most dangerous experiments in known space. If the containment protocols were failing, he turned to order the humans to evacuate, but they were already moving. Nova had pulled up schematics of the lab's quantum containment systems. Mason was reciting probability calculations faster than the Academy's computers, and Rex was doing stretches. "We've got this, Professor," Mason said, his voice carrying that strange human quality that somehow inspired confidence against all logic. "After all, what's the worst that could happen?" "The complete unraveling of reality as we know it," Zalax replied flatly. Rex's grin somehow grew wider. "Exactly. Finally, a real challenge. Nova, remember that theory we were working on about using dance patterns to stabilize dimensional rifts? The one based on Earth's quantum tango theory?" Nova asked, already pulling up more calculations. "We don't have a quantum tango theory," Mason sighed. "We do now," Rex and Nova replied in unison. As Zalax watched the three humans race toward what should have been certain doom, he found himself wondering if perhaps the greatest discovery in the history of the Academy wouldn't be some new scientific principle or tactical innovation. Perhaps it would be the discovery that the impossible was merely improbable, and improbability was just another dance waiting to be learned. His spots flickered in what might have been resignation, or possibly hope. "Computer, begin recording, emergency log, Day 15 of the Human Integration Initiative. It appears we're about to discover whether Earth dancing can prevent the collapse of reality itself. And somehow, that's not even the strangest thing that's happened this week." The alarms continued to blare as Zalax hurried after his impossible students, already trying to figure out how he would explain this to the Galactic Council. Somehow, he suspected they wouldn't believe him. He barely believed it himself, and he was watching it happen with all four eyes. The revolution of impossible things. The Dimensional Research Lab looked like a quantum bomb had gone off inside a kaleidoscope. Reality itself seemed to hiccup and stutter, with objects existing in multiple states simultaneously and time flowing in at least three different directions. In the center of the chaos, a rift in spacetime pulsed with energies that shouldn't exist in this universe. And in the middle of it all, three humans were dancing. "Professor," Commander Bright Spire's crystalline form harmonized with concern, "should we initiate emergency evacuation protocols?" Zalax's spots flickered in patterns that would have made a quantum physicist blush. I don't know. I've never seen anything like this." Nova Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Mason, we need a stronger baseline rhythm. Rex, watch your quantum footwork, you're phase shifting too fast." The three humans had formed a triangle around the reality rift, their movements synchronized in ways that seemed to both obey and defy physics simultaneously. Nova's hands traced patterns in the air that left quantum probability trails, creating a complex lattice of mathematical certainty. Mason Drake was calling out calculations in a rhythmic cadence that somehow stabilized the local spacetime continuum. And Rex Thompson. Rex Thompson was doing something that looked like a cross between a waltz and a quantum computation. Are they actually containing the rift? Professor NX Clax's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "Not just containing it," Commander Bright Spire chimed, his crystalline form resonating with complex harmonics. "They're dancing with it. Look at the quantum field readings." The rift's chaotic energies were beginning to pulse in time with the humans' movements. Where there had been random dimensional tears, now there was a pattern. Where reality had been unraveling, it was beginning to weave itself back together in new and impossible ways. "It's working." Nova called out, her quantum probability lattice growing more complex by the second. "Mason, start the convergence sequence." Mason's rhythmic calculations took on a new pattern, something that sounded almost like Earth poetry but contained mathematical principles that made Zalax's auxiliary brain ache. "Time to bring it home." Rex shouted, his quantum dance reaching a crescendo. "Hey Professor, watch this, I call it the temporal tango." What happened next would later require the creation of 3 new branches of physics to explain. The humans' combined efforts, Nova's probability manipulation, Mason's mathematical rhythms, and Rex's reality-bending dance, created something entirely new. The rift didn't just close, it collapsed in on itself in a way that left behind something unexpected. Is that? Professor NX Clax's mandibles locked up in shock. Is that a stable microuniverse? Where the dangerous rift had been, a perfectly contained bubble of reality floated serenely, displaying properties that should have been impossible. Inside it, new physics were being born. "Ha," Rex said, straightening his uniform. "Didn't expect that. But hey, when life gives you quantum lemons, make quantum lemonade," Nova suggested, already taking readings of their accidental creation. "I was going to say, create a new universe, but yours works too." Zalax approached the bubble cautiously, his spots cycling through colors that hadn't been seen since the birth of the first stars. "Do you 3 have any idea what you've just done? Created a stable pocket universe through the application of Earth dance theory to quantum mechanics?" Mason offered. "Prove that reality is just another dance partner." Rex grinned. "Revolutionized our understanding of dimensional physics while simultaneously developing a new form of emergency response protocols." Nova added, still taking readings. "Yes," Zalax said, his translator struggling to convey the magnitude of the moment. "All of that. And something more. You've just changed everything we thought we knew about everything." The news spread through the Academy faster than a quantum particle through probability space. Within hours, students from every species were approaching the humans with questions, theories, and requests for dance lessons. The traditional study groups began to transform as different species tried to incorporate their own cultural movements into the humans' quantum theories. The crystalline students from the luminary systems found that their natural resonance patterns could create similar probability fields. The multidimensional thinking of the Hydra Collective discovered they could use their distributed consciousness to maintain multiple quantum states simultaneously. Even the energy beings from the Zeta cluster began experimenting with new ways to manipulate reality. But not everyone was thrilled with these developments. "This is completely unacceptable." Professor Rigidus thundered at the emergency faculty meeting, his silicon-based form crackling with anger. "They're making a mockery of 10,000 years of established scientific principles." "Are they?" Commander Bright Spire challenged, his crystalline form glowing with unusual intensity. "Or are they showing us that our principles were too rigid?" The pun made several faculty members groan, but the point stood. The humans hadn't just survived the Academy's impossible curriculum, they were rewriting it, expanding it, making it more accessible to species that had previously struggled with certain concepts. "Consider the implications," Nova Chen was explaining to a group of students in what had once been the quantum physics lab but had somehow evolved into a combination dance studio and research facility. "Every species has its own ways of moving, its own rhythms, its own patterns. What if those aren't just cultural expressions? What if they're actually different ways of interpreting and manipulating reality itself?" The idea spread like wildfire through the Academy. Traditional classes began to incorporate movement and rhythm into their teaching methods. The combat simulations evolved to include elements of dance and cultural expression. Even the psychic resistance training was transformed as students discovered that their species' natural movements could help stabilize their mental states. "It's not about learning to think like everyone else," Mason Drake explained during a particularly revolutionary xenobiology class. "It's about learning to think like yourself, but in new dimensions." The changes weren't without their challenges. Several traditional faculty members resigned in protest. Some students struggled to adapt to the new methodologies. And the Galactic Council was becoming increasingly concerned about reports of dancing quantum physicists and singing spacetime mechanics. But the results were undeniable. Test scores were rising across all species. Combat simulation success rates had doubled. And perhaps most importantly, different species were beginning to understand each other in ways that went beyond mere translation. "You have to admit," Rex Thompson said to Zalax one evening, as they watched a group of crystalline students attempt to merge their natural resonance patterns with Earth hip-hop, "it's pretty amazing what happens when you let people be impossible together." Zalax's spots flickered in what might have been amusement, or possibly resignation. "I'm beginning to think that's the real lesson here. Not that humans are impossible, but that impossibility itself is subjective. Now you're getting it." Rex grinned. "Speaking of impossible things, we've been working on a new theory about using dance patterns to enhance faster-than-light travel. Want to hear about it?" Before Zalax could respond, and possibly prevent another revolution in physics, alarms began blaring throughout the academy again. But this time, they were different, emergency signals he hadn't heard in centuries. "Multiple quantum anomalies detected in nearby space," the computer announced. "Warning, pattern matches ancient Void Dancer invasion protocols." The humans exchanged glances. "Void Dancers?" Nova asked, already pulling up historical records. "An ancient species that nearly destroyed the galaxy by weaponizing quantum dance patterns," Zalax explained, his spots going pale. "We thought they were extinct." "Well," Rex said, his grin somehow wider than ever, "looks like it's time for the ultimate dance-off." As Zalax watched his impossible students race off to face yet another impossibility, he found himself wondering if perhaps this had been the Void Dancer's mistake, assuming that impossible things couldn't happen. "Computer, begin recording, crisis log, day 30 of the Human Integration Initiative. It appears we're about to discover whether Earth dance moves can save the galaxy. And somehow, that's still not the strangest thing these humans have done this week." The alarms continued to blare as the Academy prepared for what might be its greatest challenge yet. But for the first time in his long career, Zalax found himself looking forward to seeing how his students would make the impossible possible. After all, they'd been practicing. The Dance of Darkness. The Academy's Central Command Chamber had never been so crowded. Representatives from every species currently enrolled stood around the holographic display, watching as the Void Dancer's fleet emerged from quantum space. Their ships moved in patterns that hurt to look at, each movement leaving trails of corrupted reality in their wake. "Well," Rex Thompson said, breaking the tense silence, "they definitely know how to make an entrance." Professor Zalax's spots were cycling through warning patterns so rapidly that several empathic students had to leave the room. The historical records don't do them justice. Their quantum manipulation abilities have evolved over the millennia. The holographic display showed the Void Dancer's ships performing what looked like a deadly ballet through spacetime itself. Where they danced, reality cracked and warped, creating paths that shouldn't exist and weapons that violated the laws of physics. According to the archives, Nova Chen reported, her fingers flying over multiple data pads simultaneously, they nearly destroyed the galaxy by weaponizing quantum dance patterns. Their technology allows them to convert movement into pure destructive energy. "So they're evil space choreographers?" Rex asked. "Finally, all those dance competition trophies from high school are going to pay off. This isn't a joke," Cadet Thompson, Professor Rigidus crackled, his silicon form vibrating with anger. "The Void Dancers are the most dangerous species ever encountered. They're dancers," Mason Drake interrupted, his voice carrying that strange human quality that made everyone listen. "They understand reality as movement, just like we've been doing. The difference is, they're using it to destroy." "Exactly." Nova's eyes lit up with understanding. "They're not just fighting, they're performing. Every attack is part of a larger pattern, a deadly choreography that we can counter." Rex finished, already moving in ways that left quantum probability trails in the air. "Professor Zalax, remember how we contained that reality rift? What if we could do that on a larger scale?" Zalax's spots flickered in disbelief. "That's impossible. The energy requirements alone would be massive," Commander Bright Spire chimed in, his crystalline form resonating with excitement. But what if we combined our abilities? The Luminaries' natural resonance patterns, the Hydra Collective's multidimensional thinking, the humans' quantum dance theories. The command chamber erupted into a chaos of voices and movements as different species began offering their own cultural insights. The crystalline students demonstrated how their harmonic frequencies could stabilize quantum fields. The energy beings from Zeta Cluster showed how they could channel pure energy through motion. Even the traditionally stoic silicon-based students began discussing how their rigid structures could provide anchoring points for reality itself. "It's crazy," Professor NX Clax chittered, her mandibles clicking rapidly. "But it might be just crazy enough to work." "That's humanity's secret weapon," Rex grinned. "We specialize in crazy." The plan that emerged was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. While the Academy's traditional defenses would engage the Void Dancers' fleet directly, teams of students and faculty would perform a counter-choreography designed to stabilize the damaged reality and turn the enemy's own quantum manipulation against them. "Think of it like a battle of the bands," Mason explained to the confused alien students, "but instead of music, we're playing with the fabric of reality itself. And instead of judges, we have the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance," Nova added, still working on probability calculations. No pressure. The preparations were unlike anything the Academy had ever seen. The main hangar bay was converted into a massive quantum dance studio, with different species practicing their movements in perfect synchronization. The luminary crystals sang in harmonies that made reality shimmer, while the Hydra Collective linked minds to maintain complex probability patterns. "Remember," Nova instructed, moving through a series of steps that left mathematical equations floating in the air, "it's not about copying Earth dances exactly. It's about finding your own way to move through quantum space. Your natural patterns are your strength," Mason added, demonstrating how different species could adapt their movements to work together. "The Void Dancers think they're the only ones who understand the dance of reality. We're going to show them they're wrong." As the enemy fleet drew closer, Professor Zalax found himself doing something unprecedented. He joined the practice sessions. His species' natural ability to predict patterns made him an excellent coordinator for the various groups. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted to Commander Bright Spire, "but perhaps the humans were right. We've been teaching the science of the universe, but we forgot about its art." The Void Dancers struck at dawn. Their ships descended through Centaur Prime's atmosphere in a terrible dance of destruction, their movements tearing holes in reality itself. The sky turned colors that shouldn't exist as quantum weapons distorted the very fabric of spacetime. But the Academy was ready. As the first wave of attacks began, the defenders launched their counter-performance. Thousands of beings moved in perfect synchronization, each according to their own nature but all part of a greater whole. The Luminari sang frequencies that stabilized reality. The Hydra Collective maintained probability matrices that redirected quantum energy. The energy beings from Zeta Cluster channeled pure power through carefully choreographed movements. And in the center of it all, three humans led the dance. Nova's probability lattices created safe paths through the chaos. Mason's calculated rhythms kept everyone synchronized across multiple dimensions. And Rex Thompson faced the Void Dancer's deadliest weapons with nothing but a grin and what he called Earth's secret weapon, interpretive dance. The battle that followed would later be described as the Symphony of Impossible Things. Where the Void Dancers tried to tear reality apart, the Academy's united species wove it back together in new and beautiful ways. When quantum weapons threatened to erase whole sections of spacetime, hundreds of different beings moved in patterns that restored them. "They're faltering," Commander Bright Spire announced, his crystalline form glowing with triumph. "Their patterns are breaking down." He was right. The Void Dancers, faced with a defense they had never encountered in their long history, began to lose their perfect synchronization. Their deadly dance became chaotic, their attacks unfocused. "Now!" Nova shouted, her probability lattice expanding to encompass the entire battlefield. Everyone, final movement. What happened next would be studied in the Academy for centuries to come. Every being, every species, every unique form of movement and energy came together in a single, perfect moment of harmony. The humans' theories about quantum dance merged with 10,000 years of galactic knowledge to create something entirely new. The Void Dancers' ships, caught in the wave of unified quantum manipulation, found their own energy turned back upon them. Their reality-warping weapons collapsed in on themselves, creating a cascade of dimensional inversions that trapped their entire fleet in a pocket universe of their own making. As the last echoes of battle faded, Professor Zalax stood in the command chamber, his spots displaying colors that had no name in any known language. Computer, begin recording, Victory Log, Day 45 of the Human Integration Initiative. Today, we discovered that the impossible is not a limitation, it's an invitation to dance. Rex Thompson, somehow still grinning despite everything, turned to the assembled beings. So, same time next week for practice? The laughter that followed was perhaps the most impossible thing of all. Thousands of different species, each expressing joy in their own unique way, united in the understanding that they had not just survived the impossible. They had danced with it. And in doing so, they had changed the galaxy forever. A new dance. The graduation ceremony of the Galactic Defense Academy had always been a formal affair, steeped in 10,000 years of tradition. But as Professor Zalax stood on the quantum glass stage of the Grand Ceremonial Hall, he knew this year would be different. It had to be. Nothing could really go back to normal after you'd saved reality itself with interpretive dance. Computer, begin recording, final assessment, Day 365 of the Human Integration Initiative. His spots flickered with colors that somehow managed to convey both amusement and pride. I find myself in the unprecedented position of having to create an entirely new category of graduation honors. Outstanding achievement in reality-saving choreography was not something I ever expected to add to our curriculum. The ceremonial hall was packed with beings from across the galaxy. The Void Dancers' defeat had made headlines everywhere, and the Academy's revolutionary methods had become the subject of intense interest throughout civilized space. Representatives from hundreds of worlds had come to witness this historic graduation. But first, Zalax continued, his translator working overtime to convey the complexity of his emotions. We should address the changes their presence has catalyzed throughout our institution. The physical transformations were obvious. The traditional lecture halls had been redesigned to accommodate movement-based learning. The combat simulation chambers now included dance studios and quantum choreography labs. Even the theoretical physics department had installed gravity-variable floors for species-specific movement practices. But the real changes went deeper. In the past year, Zalax addressed the assembled crowd. We have discovered that the impossible is not a wall to be broken, but a partner to be danced with. Our 3 human students, Mason Drake, Nova Chen, and Rex Thompson, didn't just survive our curriculum. They transformed it, and in doing so, they transformed us. In the front row, the 3 humans sat in their ceremonial robes, each modified to allow for maximum movement range, Rex had insisted. Behind them, their fellow graduates represented the most diverse class in Academy history. Species that had previously struggled with certain aspects of the curriculum were now excelling, thanks to teaching methods that embraced their natural ways of moving and thinking. The Void Dancers taught us to fear the dance of reality, Zalax continued, his spots pulsing with passionate colors. They saw the movement of the universe as a weapon to be wielded. But our human friends showed us a different way. They taught us that every species has its own dance, its own rhythm, its own way of moving through the quantum foam of existence. Commander Bright Spire's crystalline form chimed in harmony with Zalax's words. The Luminary Champion had become one of the strongest supporters of the new methods, his natural resonance patterns proving particularly effective in quantum choreography classes. Professor Rex Thompson called out, that familiar grin still in place, you might want to wrap up the speech soon. I think Nova's probability lattice is picking up some interesting readings from the quantum realm. Indeed, Nova Chen's hands were already moving in familiar patterns, leaving trails of mathematical certainty in the air. Mason Drake had shifted into a ready stance, and the other graduates were following suit, each in their own unique way. Seriously? Zalax's spots flickered in disbelief. Today of all days? The universe doesn't take graduation days off, Mason shrugged. Besides, what better way to demonstrate the practical applications of our education? As if on cue, reality hiccuped. The space above the ceremonial stage began to twist in familiar ways, and sensors throughout the academy started detecting quantum anomalies. But this time, no one panicked. Instead, the graduating class rose as one, each species moving according to their nature but all part of a greater harmony. The luminary crystals began to sing in reality-stabilizing frequencies. The Hydra Collective linked minds to maintain probability matrices. The energy beings from Zeta Cluster channeled their power through carefully practiced movements. And at the center of it all, 3 humans led what had become known as the quantum concordance, a combination of dance, science, and pure impossibility that had revolutionized galactic defense. The dimensional disturbance, faced with such a unified response, didn't just dissipate, it transformed. Where there had been a potential threat, now there was an opportunity. The graduates' combined movements shaped the quantum anomaly into a controlled demonstration of their new skills. Now that, Rex announced to the awestruck audience, is what I call a graduation performance. The applause that followed came in hundreds of different forms: crystalline chimes, energy pulses, quantum resonances, and good old-fashioned human clapping. It was a symphony of diversity, each species celebrating in their own way but all part of the same joy. Zalax's spots displayed patterns that would later be incorporated into the Academy's new logo. Computer, amend recording. It seems our graduation ceremony has become an impromptu demonstration of everything these students have learned. And perhaps that's fitting. After all, the greatest lesson we've learned this year is that the universe itself is an endless dance, and we are all invited to join in. As the celebration continued, plans were already being made. The Academy would establish new branches across the galaxy, each incorporating both traditional knowledge and the new quantum kinetic methods. Research was underway to explore other applications of movement-based reality manipulation. And perhaps most importantly, species that had long stood apart were learning to dance together. You know what this means, don't you? Rex asked his fellow graduates as they celebrated later that evening. The galaxy's finally ready for my greatest invention, the Quantum Breakdancing Championship. Please tell me you're joking, Mason groaned. Actually, Nova interjected, her hands already moving through probability calculations, if we adjust the gravity fields and incorporate multidimensional spin mechanics. See? Rex's grin somehow grew even wider. Nova gets it. Who's up for making the impossible possible one more time? As Zalax watched his students, no, his graduates, begin planning their next impossible achievement, he found himself doing something he'd been doing more and more lately, dancing. His species had never been known for physical expression, but he'd learned that everyone had their own way of moving through reality. Computer, final recording, the Human Integration Initiative has officially concluded. But in truth, it's only the beginning. We set out to teach 3 humans our ways, and instead, they taught us that the universe is larger, stranger, and more wonderful than we ever imagined. And the dance is just beginning. The celebration lasted well into the night, with thousands of beings moving together in patterns that rewrote the very fabric of reality. And somewhere, in the quantum foam between moments, the universe itself seemed to smile. After all, it had been waiting a very long time for its children to learn how to dance.